Hello, everyone! Today we're going to begin with a story that still burns in my memory, like a wound that refuses to heal. I see it, right there, frozen in time, the dim porch light flickering above me, the sound of my son's voice, soft, almost trembling, as he whispered the words I never thought I would hear. "You don't belong here anymore." And then, the click of the lock sliding into place, the door shut. The house, my son's house, was no longer mine. And I stood outside, clutching nothing but silence, with the cold night pressing hard against my skin. At that moment, the world narrowed to a single sound, the echo of the lock. It was sharp, final, louder than thunder. And with it, something inside me cracked. Not just my heart, but the belief that family was forever. I didn't shout, I didn't beg. I didn't even raise my hand to knock again. Instead, I stood there, numb, as the winter air wrapped around me. My breath fogged in front of my face, and in the quiet street, I felt smaller than I had in my entire life. This was my son, the child I had raised, the boy I once held against my chest, the man I thought would always know my love. And yet, on that night, he treated me like a stranger. Worse than a stranger. Because strangers, at least, don't carry the power to destroy you with a single sentence. I want you to imagine that moment with me. Imagine standing outside a house filled with warm light, laughter, and family, while you remain on the other side of the door. Unwanted. Erased. It wasn't just the cold that made me shiver. It was the realization that love, the kind I had poured into him for decades, could be locked away so easily. And here's the hardest part. I wasn't innocent either. Somewhere along the years, something had shifted. Little things I ignored. Small silences I never filled. Moments of pride or stubbornness that built into walls neither of us could see until it was too late. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I'm doing here. And please, let me know in the comments. Where are you watching this story from? And when? Because this isn't just my story. It could belong to anyone who's ever felt the sting of being cast out by the very people they love most. That night, I walked away slowly, step by step. Not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. The door was locked, the words were spoken, and I had to carry them with me, like a shadow I could never outrun. "You don't belong here anymore." Those words, they weren't just a sentence. They were a verdict. A sentence passed down by the one person I never expected to judge me. But I promise you, this is only the beginning. Because behind those words lies a history of sacrifice, betrayal, and silence. A story of how a family can fall apart piece by piece, until one night, all that's left is a parent standing outside, wondering when love turned into exile. And tonight, I'm ready to tell you that story. The night was quiet. Too quiet. When the door locked behind me, the sound seemed to echo into the empty street, louder than any car horn, louder than the wind pushing through bare branches. I stood there for longer than I care to admit. At first, I thought he might come back. That maybe, just maybe, he would open the door again, tell me it was a mistake, say he didn't mean it. But minutes stretched into silence. No footsteps, no apologies, only the faint glow of light bleeding from the windows, shadows moving inside. Life continued without me. I remember the cold biting my cheeks. I pulled my coat tighter around me, but it wasn't the winter chill that froze me. It was the realization. I wasn't welcome in my son's home anymore. It had been building, hadn't it? Little hints I had brushed aside. The way he avoided long conversations. The polite but distant greetings from his wife. The sudden absence of phone calls that once came every week. And now here it was, spelled out clearly, not in words alone, but in action. The lock, the silence, the exile. I began walking, my feet crunching against the thin layer of frost on the sidewalk. Every step felt heavy, like dragging years of memories behind me. I thought about birthdays, about late nights spent rocking him when fevers burned his little body, about the scraped knees I kissed, the homework I helped him with, the nights I stayed awake, waiting to hear his key in the door when he was a teenager out too late. And I thought, was it all for nothing? Was love so fragile that it could be forgotten, replaced, erased? As I walked, I noticed the world around me, as if for the first time. The street lamps buzzing faintly, a dog barking 2 houses down, the smell of smoke from someone's fireplace drifting into the cold air. It was ordinary, but for me, everything was different. The world had tilted. I was no longer a parent in the way I had always believed. I was an outsider. The night seemed to swallow me whole. There's something cruel about silence. It doesn't just surround you, it speaks. It tells you things you don't want to hear. It whispers doubts, regrets, questions that stab at you when you're weakest. I found myself replaying the moment again and again. His voice, low, quiet, almost ashamed, as he whispered, "You don't belong here anymore." Why whisper? Why not shout, slam the door in anger? The whisper carried something worse than rage. It carried finality. Like he believed it. Like he had thought about it for a long time. I reached the end of the block before I realized my eyes were wet. I hadn't noticed the tears until the wind stung against them. I wiped my face quickly, glancing around, embarrassed, even though no one was watching. That's the strange thing about rejection. You don't just feel hurt, you feel ashamed, as if being cast out means you've failed at something essential, failed at being good enough to keep the love of your own child. And shame, it settles deep, deeper than anger, deeper than sadness. It makes you question everything you are. I stopped walking and leaned against a streetlight, breathing hard. My chest felt tight, like invisible hands were pressing down. Not just from grief, but from the weight of years. Decades of giving, hoping, sacrificing, and now facing the truth that none of it guaranteed belonging. In that moment, I wanted to scream. I wanted to pound on his door, demand answers, demand that he look me in the eye and explain how we got here. But I didn't, because part of me already knew the answer. The cracks in our relationship hadn't formed tonight. They had been spreading for years. I had just refused to see them, so I kept walking, past familiar houses, past glowing windows where other families were gathered, laughing, eating, being together. I caught glimpses through curtains, shadows of people sharing warmth I no longer had. It was torture and comfort at the same time, proof that life goes on, but also proof that mine had been torn apart. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking, not just from the cold, but from the fear. Fear of what came next. Fear of what it meant to live outside my own family. I sat inside the car for a long time before turning the key. The silence there was heavier, pressing against me from all sides. I stared at the steering wheel, at the dashboard lights glowing faintly, and I thought, where do I go from here? Not just tonight, but in life. If I don't belong there, then where do I belong? The night didn't give me an answer. It only gave me silence, and the silence felt endless. That was the first night I realized exile isn't always a place. Sometimes it's a feeling, a truth you carry inside, no matter where you stand. As I drove away slowly, headlights cutting through the frost, I knew this was only the beginning. The real story wasn't about the door closing. It was about the years that led up to it, and the years I would have to face after it. Distance never begins with a slammed door. It begins quietly, like a whisper you ignore, like a hairline crack in glass that seems harmless, until one day the whole thing shatters. Looking back now, I can see where the distance first began. At the time, it seemed so small, so ordinary, that I brushed it aside. But the truth is, love doesn't collapse in a single moment. It erodes, piece by piece, when we stop noticing each other. The first signs came after he left home for college. I remember standing in his empty room the day after he moved out. The posters still clung to the walls, the bed unmade, the air heavy with the smell of his cologne. I sat there, telling myself this was natural. Children grow, they leave, they create their own lives. And yet, when the phone calls came less often, I felt a sting. When he skipped a holiday visit, I told myself it was just scheduling. When he grew quiet on the phone, answering in short sentences, I convinced myself it was stress. I excused everything because I didn't want to face the truth. We were drifting. Conversations that once lasted hours became practical check-ins. Are you okay? Do you need anything? Yes, I'm fine. And that was it. No details about his classes, no stories about new friends, no laughter spilling through the line like before. I told myself not to push. I wanted him to feel free, to know I trusted him to live his own life. But silence built its own walls. And each time I accepted less, each time I let go of asking, the distance grew. Then came the choices I didn't understand. He took jobs far away, ones that kept him busy during family gatherings. He missed birthdays, anniversaries, small celebrations. At first, he apologized. Later, he stopped apologizing. It was as if he no longer felt guilty for being absent. I kept saying, "It's okay, I understand." But inside, I felt the ache. Because deep down, I didn't understand. I didn't know how the boy who once ran to me after school, eager to tell me everything, had turned into a man who shared nothing. Sometimes distance shows in words, but more often it shows in the lack of them. There were no arguments, no fights, no shouting, only silence. And silence can be louder than any storm. I tried to fill it with gestures, care packages sent to his dorm, money tucked quietly into his bank account, a visit here and there, though he always seemed too busy to really spend time. He thanked me politely, but there was a chill in his gratitude, as if the warmth had been drained away. I also noticed how he began to compare me, little remarks that stung, even though I smiled through them. Other parents don't call this much. Other moms don't worry so much. Other dads don't hold on so tightly. Each sentence was a reminder that in his eyes, I was no longer enough. Or maybe too much. I wanted to tell him that my love was different, not better or worse, just mine. But I bit my tongue, because pride is a dangerous thing, and mine told me to stay quiet. And then came the silences during visits. We'd sit at the same table, but it felt like there was a wall between us. He scrolled through his phone. I stirred my coffee, waiting for him to speak. Minutes passed in awkward quiet. I'd ask a question. He'd answer with one sentence. And then the silence returned. I'd leave those visits feeling emptier than before, because at least when he was away, I could imagine we were still close. Sitting together made it clear. We weren't. Sometimes love makes you blind. I thought if I kept giving, kept supporting, the distance would close. But giving without connection doesn't heal a gap. It widens it. Because the more I gave without receiving warmth in return, the more invisible I felt. And maybe he felt suffocated. Maybe he thought my presence was a reminder of a life he wanted to leave behind. That's the thing about distance. It doesn't just come from one side. It grows in the space between two hearts, each one believing the other will bridge the gap. But neither of us did. There was one moment I remember vividly, a family dinner. The table was full, laughter all around. But he sat quietly, barely looking at me. When someone asked him a question, he answered quickly, eyes drifting elsewhere. And when I tried to join in, his smile looked forced, as if my words were interruptions. That night, after everyone left, I stood at the sink washing dishes, and I realized I hadn't had a real conversation with my son in months. We were present in the same room, but our connection was absent. It was then I first felt the fear that love alone wouldn't be enough to hold us together. Looking back, those were the seeds, small silences, missed moments, words unspoken. I ignored them, thinking time would fix everything. But time doesn't heal distance, it stretches it. By the time I noticed how far apart we had grown, it was already too late to pretend it was temporary. The seeds had been planted, and eventually they grew into the wall that separated us completely. Every story of distance has a turning point. For me, that moment arrived the day he brought someone new into his life. At first, I was happy. I wanted to be happy. After all, isn't it every parent's dream to see their child find love, build a family, create their own circle of joy? And in the beginning, that's exactly how I framed it. I told myself this was good, healthy, a sign he was growing into the man I had raised him to be. But slowly, the presence of someone new shifted the balance. Not in a loud, obvious way. It was subtle, like the quiet movement of shadows across a room, hardly noticeable until one day the entire space feels darker. The first time we met, she was charming. Her smile was polite, her words sweet. She complimented the dinner I cooked, told me how lucky she felt to have found him. I remember thinking, she's exactly what he needs, kind, warm, supportive. But beneath that sweetness, I sensed something else. A watchfulness, a need to measure every word, every glance, every interaction. It was as though she was silently asking herself, how much space will his family take up in our lives? At the time, I ignored it. I wanted to believe my instincts were wrong. I wanted to believe she would embrace me as part of their new world. The changes started small. Phone calls that used to come at night grew shorter. When I asked how he was doing, his answers felt rehearsed, as though someone else was listening, editing his words before they left his mouth. Invitations, once frequent, began to dwindle. Instead of, come over whenever you like, it became, we'll let you know when it's a good time. At first, I thought they were busy. Then I realized, it wasn't busyness, it was boundaries. Not his boundaries. Heron family gatherings felt different too. When she was there, he seemed less himself, more cautious, more deliberate, as though every gesture was under review. If I spoke too long, she'd redirect the conversation. If I offered advice, she'd smile politely and then dismiss it later with a subtle remark. Nothing dramatic, nothing cruel, just enough. Enough to make me feel like a guest in my own son's presence. And then came the comparisons. Her family does it differently. Her mother says this is the right way. Her father always taught her. Every word chipped away at me, carving out a space where I no longer fit. I wasn't the foundation anymore. I was the background noise, polite to acknowledge, easy to ignore. I tried to adapt. I told myself it was natural. When you build a life with someone new, their influence becomes strong. But I hadn't expected that influence to feel like a replacement. When I gave him gifts, she would critique them. When I cooked his favorite meals, she'd mention how unhealthy they were. When I offered to help, she'd decline with a smile that felt more like a dismissal. And slowly, my son began to mirror her. He repeated her phrases. He echoed her concerns. Until one day, I realized I wasn't speaking to him anymore. I was speaking to both of them. And in that partnership, my voice always carried less weight. There's a kind of manipulation that doesn't shout. It whispers. It doesn't push you away violently. It guides you gently until you're standing outside without realizing how you got there. I could feel her shaping him, not always maliciously, perhaps not even consciously, but the more he leaned toward her, the more he leaned away from me. And I, desperate to hold on, found myself shrinking, accepting smaller and smaller pieces of him, afraid that if I asked for too much, I'd lose even that. The final confirmation came one evening during dinner. We were all at the table, and I mentioned a story from his childhood. A sweet, innocent memory about the time he'd gotten lost at the park, only to be found hours later eating ice cream with a kind stranger. Everyone laughed, except her. Her smile was tight, her eyes sharp. And later that night, my son called me privately. "Don't bring up those old stories anymore," he said softly. "She doesn't like them." That was when I understood. Pieces of our shared past were being erased, not because they were painful, but because they didn't include her. It's a strange thing to realize you're being rewritten out of someone's life. Not cut out violently, but edited away line by line, until all that remains is a shadow of the bond you once had. I began to see it everywhere. Photos on social media where my presence was cropped out. Decisions made without consulting me. Conversations where my input no longer mattered. The new influence wasn't just present. She was defining the narrative. And my son, perhaps blinded by love, didn't see the cost. I don't blame love for this. Love is powerful. It shapes us, makes us better, sometimes worse. But love combined with control can isolate. And I watched as the circle around my son grew tighter, leaving less and less room for me. The boy who once needed me for everything now seemed to need me for nothing. And yet, paradoxically, I was still the silent supporter, always standing behind, always giving. The new influence didn't erase me outright, but she taught him how to live without me. That was when I first felt the shift turn permanent. The seeds of distance had already taken root. But now, with her influence shaping the soil, they grew stronger, taller, until I could barely see my son behind them. And I began to wonder, was I losing him because of her? Or was I losing him because he wanted to be lost? Love, in its truest form, is sacrifice. Not the kind you boast about, not the kind you keep score of, but the kind that becomes invisible, woven so deeply into daily life that no one even notices it's there. I had lived my whole life this way, pouring pieces of myself into my son's future. And for years, I never needed thanks. The smile on his face, the sound of his laughter, the sight of him growing strong, that was enough. But the night he locked me out, whispered, I didn't belong, all those sacrifices came rushing back. Not as pride, but as questions. Questions I never thought I'd ask. Did it matter? Did he ever see it? Did he ever care? I remember the early days, when he was just a boy, sick with fever. I stayed awake through the night, a damp cloth in one hand, medicine in the other. Every hour I checked his breathing, every sigh of relief was my reward. I remember the mornings when I skipped meals so he could have enough. Rice on his plate, a smile on his face, while I told him I wasn't hungry. He believed me, and I told myself it didn't matter. That's what parents do. There were years when I worked 2 jobs, not because I wanted more, but because he needed more. School fees, clothes that helped him fit in, books he could be proud to carry. I gave up new shoes, vacations, simple comforts, all so he could walk into the world without shame. And when he wanted something beyond my reach, I found a way. Even if it meant staying up at night, worrying about the bills, juggling debts in silence. He never knew, because children shouldn't carry the weight of their parents' struggle. Sacrifice became second nature. When he needed me to drive across town in the middle of the night, I did it. When he called, afraid or uncertain, I answered, even if it meant leaving work, even if it meant ignoring my own needs. Every choice I made bent toward him. I thought this was what love required. I thought someday, when he was older, he would understand. That he would see the quiet cost of everything he had. But here I was, standing on the other side of his door, realizing he had forgotten. Or worse, maybe he never noticed at all. There's a cruel truth about sacrifice. If it's never acknowledged, it begins to feel invisible. And when it's invisible, it can be rewritten. The giver becomes the burden. The love becomes the negative energy that others resent. That's what stung the most. Not that I had given so much, because giving was never the problem, but that my giving was twisted into something ugly. As if my presence was a shadow, not a light. I think of the times he struggled as a young man. When the world knocked him down, who was there to lift him up? When his pride kept him silent, who slipped money into his account so the rent could be paid? When he failed, who sat beside him and reminded him that failure wasn't the end? It was me. Always me. And yet now, those years of devotion meant nothing. It felt as if my sacrifices had been erased, replaced by a single narrative, that I was unwanted, that I didn't belong, but memory is stubborn. As I sat alone in my quiet house after that night, they all came flooding back. The lunches I packed, the nights I stayed awake, the promises I broke to myself so I could keep promises to him. And it hurt. It hurt to know that the story he told himself was not the story I had lived, that in his eyes, my devotion had become suffocation, that in his heart, my love had become control. I realize now that sacrifice is a dangerous language. If it's unspoken, it can be forgotten. If it's spoken too often, it can be resented. And I chose silence. I thought love needed no reminder, no tally of what I gave. But silence allowed him to forget, and forgetting allowed him to believe I had done nothing. That night, as I replayed his words, I wanted to shout the truth, to remind him of everything I had given, everything I had endured for his sake. But then I stopped, because true sacrifice isn't about winning arguments. It isn't about forcing someone to remember. It's about loving, even when it costs you everything. And perhaps that was my greatest mistake. I loved so much, so blindly, that I became invisible in his eyes. Yet even as I sit with this pain, I can't regret it. Because sacrifice, though unacknowledged, shaped him. It gave him the chance to grow, to succeed, to become the man he is today, even if that man has chosen to shut me out. The irony is cruel, but it's also true. The more you give, the less they see. And sometimes, the more they take, the less they remember. So yes, my sacrifices were forgotten. But I remember. And remembering is both my punishment and my proof that I loved. Betrayal doesn't announce itself with a trumpet. It slips quietly into your life, often disguised as something small. But the first time it arrives, you never forget it. For me, it happened on a day that should have been simple, an afternoon gathering, the kind families are supposed to cherish. I had cooked his favorite meal, something I hadn't made in years. The kitchen was alive with the smell of roasted herbs, warm bread, and the slow simmer of a stew that once brought him running to the table as a child. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that this would be a way to bridge the distance. Food had always been our bond. When words failed, a warm plate spoke for me. So I set the table with care, lit candles, and told myself, tonight will feel like old times. When he arrived, he wasn't alone. She came with him, his partner, her presence filling the room before she even spoke. I smiled, greeted them warmly, though inside I felt the tension. I wanted her to feel welcome. I wanted him to see that I could make space for the woman he loved. We sat down, and for a while, it seemed normal. Small talk, polite laughter, the clinking of silverware against plates. I watched him eat the stew, waiting for that familiar spark of joy. But instead, he put his spoon down and said quietly, "It's a bit heavy, don't you think?" His words hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't just a comment about food, it was a rejection. Her eyes flickered, and I realized in that instant that he wasn't speaking to me. He was echoing her. It stung more than I expected. Not because of the stew, recipes can be adjusted, tastes change, but because it was the first time I felt him turn away from me publicly, as though my efforts were something to critique, not cherish. She smiled and added, "Yes, it's nice, but we're trying to eat lighter these days, more modern." I forced a smile, nodded, and pretended not to notice how my son looked at her for approval, not at me. That was the moment. The first crack that wasn't just silence, but betrayal. He had chosen to side with her, against me, even when there was no need. It seems so small when I retell it now. A comment about stew, a simple disagreement at the table. But betrayal rarely looks like thunder. It begins with raindrops, gathering, soaking, until you realize you're drenched. I cleaned the dishes that night in silence, my hands submerged in soapy water, my heart sinking deeper with every plate. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did, but chose not to see? Either way, I knew something had shifted. It wasn't just about food, it was about loyalty, about where he placed his trust, his allegiance. And that night, it was clear. I had lost my place. Later, when I tried to speak with him privately, he brushed me off. "Don't take it personally," he said. "She didn't mean anything by it." But that wasn't true. She had meant it, and he had allowed it. That was the betrayal, not that she spoke, but that he let her voice carry more weight than mine. From then on, I noticed the pattern. Each time we disagreed, he leaned toward her side. Each time I tried to share advice, she dismissed it, and he nodded along. And each time, my role as a parent faded, replaced by the role of an outsider tolerated only out of politeness. The first betrayal is the hardest, because it teaches you a painful truth. Love doesn't always mean loyalty, and loyalty doesn't always belong to the one who gave the most. I began to pull back, though I didn't admit it then. I stopped cooking his favorite meals. I stopped offering advice. I stopped expecting gratitude, because hope turned to hurt too quickly. But in pulling back, I also gave ground. And the more ground I gave, the more space she took. Until one day, I realized there was no space left for me at all. I still think about that night sometimes. Not the food, not the laughter that sounded forced, not even her smile, but the look on his face when he agreed with her. It was the look of a man who had already chosen sides. And though he didn't say it out loud then, the meaning was clear. You don't belong here anymore. The words hadn't been spoken yet, but they were already alive in the silence between us. If betrayal is a seed, that night was the planting. And though it would take years to grow into the locked door, the cold whisper, the final exile, I can trace it all back to that one moment when my son first turned away from me and toward her. A bowl of stew, a quiet dismissal, a son's silence, and the beginning of the end. Money is an odd thing in families. It isn't just numbers on paper. It carries weight, pride, shame, and power. And in my story, money became the invisible thread that tied us together, and the invisible knife that eventually cut us apart. The first time he asked for help, I didn't hesitate. He had just lost his job. The fear in his voice was the same fear I'd heard when he was a little boy, worried about failing a test, afraid of disappointing me. I told him not to worry. I told him I would help until he was back on his feet. At the time, I thought it was temporary, a bridge to carry him across troubled waters. I had no idea that bridge would stretch on for years. It started small, an overdue bill here, a little support with rent there. Then it grew. Car payments, medical expenses, the down payment on a home he couldn't truly afford. And each time, I told myself, this is love. This is what parents do. I dipped into my savings, the account I had built for my own future. Retirement, security, comfort in old age. All of it became less important than keeping him safe. I told myself I didn't need much. As long as he and his family had stability, I would be fine. But stability has a cost. And the cost was silence. We never spoke of it openly. He didn't want her to know, the new influence, the one who prided herself on their independence. So the payments were quiet, hidden. I wired money directly to accounts, wrote checks in secret, made phone calls to banks on his behalf. I became the ghost behind their financial foundation. Unseen, unthanked, but essential. At first, I didn't mind. Gratitude wasn't necessary. The love of my son, the sight of my grandchildren in a warm home, was enough. But over time, the silence grew heavy. When holidays came, I was thanked for the gifts I gave, never for the roof I kept over their heads. When conversations turned to money, they spoke of how hard they worked, how proud they were of managing. And I sat there, biting my tongue, knowing the truth, but too loyal to expose it. Then came the cruel twist. One evening, during a tense conversation, she looked at me across the table and said, "We don't need your constant interference. We're doing just fine on our own." Her words were sharp, her tone confident. And I looked at my son, waiting for him to speak up, to tell her the truth, that without me, they wouldn't even be sitting in that house, eating at that table. But he said nothing. He let the lie stand. He let me sit there, swallowing the insult, while the truth burned inside me like fire. That was betrayal layered over silence. From that night forward, I began to see my help differently. It wasn't love, it was a leash. A leash he resented, even as he held onto it. And perhaps she resented it too, not knowing the full truth, only sensing my invisible presence in their lives. It twisted everything. What I had given freely became, in their eyes, a form of control. They didn't see sacrifice. They saw intrusion. They didn't see love. They saw shame. There's a particular pain in being accused of manipulation when all you did was give. I had worked years, decades, to build what little I had. And instead of security, I chose sacrifice. Instead of comfort, I chose love. And in return, I was branded as someone who couldn't let go. The irony was suffocating, and yet I couldn't stop. Even after that night, when pride screamed at me to withdraw, I continued paying. Because stopping meant watching their lives crumble. And no matter how much they resented me, I couldn't bear the thought of my grandchildren losing their home, their safety. So I carried the burden silently. Month after month, dollar after dollar. Love translated into numbers they would never see. But silence changes you. It gnaws at you. And eventually, it twists even your own view of yourself. I began to wonder if they were right. Had I crossed the line? Had my love turned into control? I hated that question, because deep down, I knew the truth. I had given not to control, but to protect. Yet the more I gave, the less they saw. And the less they saw, the more they pushed me away. The night he locked me out, those unspoken sacrifices flashed before me. Every payment, every sleepless night, every choice I made to keep them afloat. And I thought, does he even remember? Or has love, disguised as money, become the very reason he believes I don't belong? The truth is, financial shadows don't just strain a family. They rewrite it. They create debts that can never be repaid. Not in money, not in words. And for me, those debts became chains, binding me to a son who no longer wanted my presence, even as he depended on it. That was the cruelest irony of all. I was both necessary and unwanted. Every story of silence eventually explodes into sound. It can't be avoided. Tension piles up like snow on a roof, and one day it collapses under its own weight. That day came for us during what should have been an ordinary evening. It began with something small, as it always does. I had stopped by with a gift for the children. Nothing extravagant, just art supplies, bright colors I knew they would love. Their faces lit up when they saw the box. Emma squealed, Jake clapped his hands. For a moment, my heart felt full again, but then came the silence. Her silence, and his too. After the children ran off to play, she cleared her throat. "We've talked about this," she said, her voice tight. "We don't want them spoiled with unnecessary things." I blinked, caught off guard. "Unnecessary?" I asked softly. "They're just paints, brushes, tools to let them be creative." She folded her arms. "That's not the point. The point is, we're their parents. We decide what they need, not you." Her words were sharp, but it wasn't the sharpness that hurt. It was the way my son sat there, silent, avoiding my eyes. "Do you feel the same?" I asked him, searching his face. His jaw tightened. And then, finally, he spoke. "She's right. You cross boundaries. You make decisions without asking us first." The words landed like stones, not because they were loud, but because they carried years of unspoken judgment, boundaries, decisions, as if my love was trespassing, as if my giving was theft. Something broke inside me, then I had held back for so long, swallowed insults, smiled through dismissals, ignored the distance. But in that moment, the dam burst. "I've crossed boundaries?" I said, my voice shaking. "Every boundary I've ever crossed was for you. Every sacrifice I've ever made, every meal I skipped, every bill I paid, was so you could stand here today, with a family, with a home." His eyes flashed, but he didn't interrupt. So I kept going. "When you couldn't pay rent, who helped you? When the bank threatened foreclosure, who stepped in? When you lost your job, who kept you afloat while you found your feet? It was me, always me. And now you sit there, letting her tell me I don't belong?" The room felt colder with every word. The children's laughter echoed faintly from the next room, oblivious to the storm building just beyond their doorway. She spoke next, her tone icy calm. "See? This is what I mean. Everything you do comes with a price. You use your help as leverage, as control. That's not love, it's manipulation." Manipulation. The word burned through me like fire. I turned to my son, waiting, begging, for him to defend me. But he didn't. He just sat there, hands folded, eyes downcast. "You believe that?" I asked him quietly. You truly believe everything I've done for you was to control you? He hesitated, and then he whispered the word that shattered me. Yes! It was the first betrayal repeated, but louder, sharper, undeniable. My chest tightened, breath catching. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to force him to remember who I was, the parent who carried him through sickness, who sacrificed everything for him. But I didn't. Instead, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Because in that moment, I realized something painful. It didn't matter what I remembered. It only mattered what he chose to believe. And he had chosen against me. The confrontation grew harsher after that. Voices rose, words sharper, the kind you can never take back. She accused me of meddling. I accused her of poisoning him against me. He told me I was clinging to the past, refusing to let him live his own life. Every sentence widened the gap, until the distance between us felt like an ocean. And yet, we were sitting only a few feet apart. At one point, I stood, my hands trembling. "Do you hear yourselves?" I said. "I gave you everything I had, and all you see is control? All you feel is resentment? If that's what my love has become in your eyes, then perhaps I truly don't belong." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the children's laughter seemed to fade, as though the house itself held its breath. He looked at me then, really looked at me. And for a fleeting second, I thought I saw the boy I once knew. The boy who clung to my hand, who whispered secrets only a child shares with a parent. But the man sitting before me wasn't that boy anymore. His face hardened again, his voice cold. "You need to stop living in the past. This is my life now, my family. And if you can't accept that, then maybe you shouldn't be part of it." That was it. The words I had feared for years, spoken aloud without hesitation. And though he hadn't yet locked me out physically, I knew the door to his heart had already begun to close. The confrontation ended with silence. I picked up my coat, walked out without another word. The night air hit me like a slap, sharp and unforgiving. I didn't cry then, not until later. In the moment, I felt only numbness, the hollow ache of someone who has given everything and discovered it was never enough. Looking back, I know this confrontation was inevitable. You can only bury hurt for so long before it claws its way to the surface. And when it does, it destroys the illusions you've clung to. That night, I lost the illusion that love alone could hold us together. And in its place, I found the truth. That even love can be twisted, redefined, and thrown back at you like a weapon. Isolation doesn't come all at once. It creeps in quietly, like frost spreading across a windowpane. At first, it's just a thin layer, easy to ignore. But soon, the whole view is blurred, and you realize you're staring at life from the outside in. That's how it felt with my son. After the confrontation, things didn't explode dramatically. There was no grand announcement that I was unwelcome. Instead, it was silence, absence, omission. I wasn't banned. I was forgotten. The first time, it was his daughter's school recital. Emma had begged me to come. She loved practicing songs with me, her little voice ringing proudly in my kitchen. I promised I would be there, front row if I could. But the night of the performance, I never received the details. No time, no location. When I asked gently a few days before, he said, "We'll let you know." But the message never came. Later, I saw photos online. My granddaughter on stage, my son and his wife smiling in the audience, and I sat alone in my living room, staring at the screen, realizing the omission wasn't an accident. It was a choice. Then came birthdays. For years, I had been the one who baked cakes, who decorated, who filled the house with laughter and gifts. But suddenly, the invitations stopped. Instead, I'd receive a polite text the next day. "We had a little party yesterday. The kids had so much fun." A little party. Without me. I tried to smile, to reply with kindness, but my hands shook on the keyboard. Because I knew the truth, celebrations still happened, but I wasn't part of them anymore. Holidays were the hardest. Christmas, once filled with the smell of pine and the sound of children tearing open gifts, became a hollow day. I waited by the phone, hoping for an invitation, even a last-minute call. Instead, silence. Sometimes, a short message late in the evening. "Merry Christmas. Hope you're well." And I would sit by my tree, the lights twinkling against ornaments my son had once made as a child. Tiny handprints, fading photos, little crafts, and wonder how something so warm could turn so cold. Isolation doesn't just mean absence from events, it means absence from lives. When Jake broke his arm, I heard about it from a neighbor. When Emma won a school award, I saw it in a passing social media post. I was no longer the first call, not even the second. I had been erased from the circle of people who mattered. And yet, the pain wasn't only in what I missed, it was in how invisible I had become. The world went on without me, as though I had never existed in their story. I began to withdraw from my own life, too. I stopped attending community gatherings, stopped reaching out to friends. When they asked about my family, I smiled and said, "They're busy." It was easier than admitting the truth, that I was alone, not because they were busy, but because they had chosen a life without me. The house grew quieter each day. Rooms once filled with grandchildren's laughter echoed with silence. The dining table, where meals once stretched into hours of conversation, became a place for one. Isolation has a sound, a weight, a texture. It's the sound of a phone that doesn't ring. It's the weight of gifts never opened. It's the texture of an empty chair at every table. I tried to reach out, of course. I sent messages. I left voicemails. Sometimes he replied. Most times he didn't. And when he did, the words were short, clipped, as if spoken out of duty rather than desire. It felt less like a conversation and more like a courtesy, a way of keeping me at arm's length while maintaining the illusion that I wasn't fully cut off. But deep down, I knew. I wasn't part of his daily life anymore. I was a guest who had overstayed, tolerated only through the occasional text. The cruelest part of isolation is watching from a distance, seeing the life you once nurtured flourish without you, smiles and photographs you're not part of, milestones you never witness firsthand, holidays you spend alone while their laughter fills another house. And yet, the world still expects you to be proud, to say, "Look how well they're doing," even as you ache with the knowledge that their happiness no longer includes you. I remember one evening vividly. It was Thanksgiving. I had roasted a small chicken for myself. Too much food for one, but too little to fill the emptiness. As I sat at the table, I could hear fireworks from nearby houses, children playing outside. And then my phone buzzed. A photo of my son's family, all gathered around a table, smiling. No caption, no invitation, just proof. Proof that they celebrated, proof that they existed without me, proof that my place had been taken by someone else. I stared at that photo for a long time, the food on my plate growing cold. And I realized that isolation isn't just being alone, it's being reminded again and again that you're unnecessary. At first, I thought it was temporary, a phase. I told myself he would come around, that he would remember. But as months turned into years, the silence became the norm, and the norm became unbearable. Isolation doesn't kill you quickly. It chips away day by day until you no longer recognize yourself, until you look in the mirror and see not a parent, not a grandparent, but a shadow of someone who used to matter. That was when I understood. Being locked out wasn't just about the door that night. It was about every missed recital, every forgotten holiday, every celebration I wasn't part of. The lock wasn't metal and wood. It was the slow erasure of my presence from his life. And that erasure was complete. Hope is a dangerous thing. It sneaks into the cracks of your heart when you least expect it, soft and quiet, like the warmth of sunlight after days of cold rain. But if you've been hurt before, hope is also terrifying, because it can vanish just as quickly as it comes. The call came late at night. I was sitting alone in the living room, the television humming softly, more for company than for interest. When the phone lit up, my breath caught in my chest. It was his name. For a moment, I stared at it, afraid to answer, afraid this was a mistake, or worse, that it was a call to tell me something was wrong, something terrible. But then I pressed accept, and his voice came through. "Hi, Mom." 2 simple words. Words I hadn't heard in so long, they felt almost foreign. He sounded tired, weary, like the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. For a brief moment, he wasn't distant, or cold, or harsh. He was my son again. The boy I remembered. The boy who used to come running into my room after nightmares, whispering those same words. "Hi, Mom." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Hello, sweetheart. How are you?" There was a pause. Then he sighed. "I don't know. Things have been hard." Hope flickered inside me like a candle. I leaned forward, clutching the phone, desperate to hold on to this fragile moment. "What's wrong?" I asked gently. "Talk to me." And for the first time in years, he did. He spoke about stress at work, about financial worries, about arguments at home. He spoke not as a man keeping me at arm's length, but as a son confiding in his mother. My heart swelled with every word. I wanted to believe this was it, the turning point, that maybe, just maybe, he remembered I wasn't the enemy, that I wasn't a burden or an intruder, but someone who had always stood in his corner. As he talked, I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't remind him of past sacrifices. I simply listened, offering the comfort I thought he had long forgotten I could give. When he finished, there was silence. Then he whispered, "I miss you." Tears blurred my vision. I pressed the phone to my ear, clinging to his voice as if it might vanish. "I miss you too," I whispered back. "Oh, how I miss you." For a moment, the years of distance melted away. It felt like a thread had been tied between us again, fragile but real. A glimmer of hope, piercing the darkness. In the days that followed, things seemed to change. He called again. We spoke about little things, his children, his work, even memories from his childhood. He laughed, and I laughed with him, and I let myself believe. Believe that maybe this was the start of healing. Maybe the door that had once been locked was opening, slowly, cautiously. I began to imagine seeing him again, to imagine sitting at the same table, sharing a meal without tension, to imagine holding my grandchildren, hearing them call me grandma with joy, not hesitation. I even allowed myself to dream of holidays together again, of being part of their lives, not as an intruder, but as family. But hope can be cruel, because just when you begin to trust it, it slips away. The first sign was subtle, a canceled call, an unanswered message, excuses about being busy, about things coming up. Then the silence returned. Not immediately, but gradually, like a shadow creeping back over the light. I tried to reach out, but the responses grew shorter again. The warmth faded, replaced by polite distance. Until one day, the calls stopped altogether. When I asked what had happened, he finally told me. "She doesn't like me talking to you so much. She thinks it stirs things up." There it was. The truth. The glimmer of hope I had clung to wasn't strong enough to withstand her influence, and once again, I was pushed back into the shadows. I hung up the phone that day with a heaviness I can't describe, because this time, it wasn't just silence. It was the confirmation that hope itself was forbidden, that the bond between us was fragile enough to be severed by a single disapproving voice. I sat in my chair, staring at nothing, replaying his words. "I miss you." Words that had filled me with joy, now cut like glass. Because missing me wasn't enough. Loving me wasn't enough. If it couldn't stand against her disapproval, then what did it matter? The glimmer of hope dimmed, and in its place came something colder. Acceptance. Acceptance that our bond might never return to what it once was. Yet, even in the face of this loss, I couldn't erase the memory of those few days. The sound of his laughter, the softness in his voice, the way he said, "Hi, Mom," again. It was like a dream I had been allowed to visit, only to wake up and find it gone. And maybe that was worse than never having it at all, because once you've felt hope, living without it feels emptier than before. Hope is dangerous, yes, but it is also stubborn. And though mine had dimmed, a tiny spark remained, hidden deep inside. And though mine had dimmed, a tiny spark remained, hidden deep inside. Because no matter how many times he turned away, no matter how many doors were locked, I couldn't stop being his mother. And a mother, even in exile, always carries hope, even if it's only a glimmer. Every fragile hope eventually collides with reality. For me, reality arrived in the form of a demand. Not a request, not a conversation, but a demand that would define everything that came after. It began with a phone call, though not one filled with warmth. His voice was tight, clipped, businesslike. "Mom, we need to talk." Something in his tone made my stomach twist. It wasn't the tone of a son reaching out. It was the tone of someone preparing to deliver a verdict. We met at his house. The children weren't there. She was. She sat beside him on the couch, her presence radiating control. And I knew, even before he opened his mouth, that this wasn't truly his voice. It was theirs. He cleared his throat, glanced at her, then back at me. "We can't go on like this," he began. "There's too much tension, too much conflict. It's not good for anyone." I nodded slowly. "I agree. But tension isn't the same as rejection. We can work through this." He cut me off. That's the problem. You think things can just be fixed with words, but they can't. Not unless you're willing to change. Change. The word hung in the air like a blade. "What kind of change?" I asked quietly. And then came the demand. "You need to step back, completely. No more unexpected visits. No more gifts for the kids without our approval. No more opinions on how we live our lives. If you want to be part of this family, you have to accept that you have no say in it." The words sliced through me, sharper than any scream. No say, no voice. Just silent presence, tolerated only on their terms. She leaned forward, adding, "It's about boundaries. You either respect them or you don't come around at all." I felt my chest tighten. Boundaries, such a clinical word, so clean, so justified. But what they were asking wasn't boundaries. It was erasure. They weren't asking me to respect their life. They were asking me to surrender mine. "Do you understand what you're asking?" I whispered. "You want me to be here, but not really here. To love, but only quietly. To exist, but without being seen." He didn't flinch. He didn't soften. He simply nodded. "Yes. That's what we need." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I looked at my son, searching for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of the boy I raised. But all I saw was a man convinced he was right, convinced that the woman beside him was the only voice that mattered. It was an ultimatum. Submit, or lose him entirely. I thought of the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the money quietly given, the years of devotion. I thought of the child I had carried, the boy who once held my hand so tightly. And I realized the cruelest truth of all. Love, no matter how deep, can be rewritten by demands. I could agree, become a shadow in their lives, mute and voiceless. Or I could refuse, and be cut off completely. For a long moment, I sat in silence. The air was heavy, the room suffocating. Finally, I spoke. "If that's what it takes to be in your life, then maybe I don't belong at all." His face hardened. "So that's your choice?" "It's not a choice," I said softly. "It's survival. I can't erase myself to fit into your world. I won't." Her eyes narrowed. "I knew this would happen," she muttered. "She'll never let go." But I wasn't holding on anymore. I was letting go, even though it tore me apart. I stood, my legs trembling, my heart breaking. "I will always love you," I told him, "but I will not beg for a place in your life that requires me to disappear." The silence that followed was final. No hugs, no apologies, just the sound of my footsteps as I walked out the door. Behind me, I heard the lock click. Not loudly, not angrily, but with the same quiet finality as before. The same sound that had haunted me once now returned, sealing my fate. That night, I sat alone in my house, staring at the walls that had witnessed decades of laughter and tears. And I realized the ultimatum hadn't been about boundaries at all. It had been about power, and I had chosen dignity over submission. But dignity is a cold companion when the cost is family. The final demand had been made, and I had answered. The question now was simple and terrifying. Could I live with that answer?